Imagine being on a transatlantic flight when you witness something that makes your blood run cold. A uniformed pilot, a man entrusted with hundreds of lives, loses control in the most shocking way possible. He doesn't just raise his voice. He raises his hand. Against a passenger. A young woman who committed no crime except refusing to be invisible. But here's what nobody in that cabin knew, including the pilot himself. The woman he just struck wasn't just any passenger. She was the one person on Earth who could end his entire career with a single phone call. Because she didn't just own a ticket on that plane. She owned the plane itself. She owned the airline. She owned everything. This is the story of Amara Chen, a 29-year-old venture capitalist who bought a failing airline in secret, and Captain David Brennan, a 26-year veteran pilot who made the catastrophic mistake of judging a book by its cover at 37,000 feet. What followed wasn't just revenge. It was a masterclass in how power, when wielded with precision, can dismantle arrogance and rebuild an entire culture from the ashes. The departure lounge at Boston Logan International Airport hummed with the familiar chaos of international travel. Flight 447 to Paris Charles de Gaulle was now boarding, and the usual parade of privilege was making its way toward the gate. Business executives clutched their leather briefcases. Wealthy tourists juggled shopping bags from duty-free. Everyone in the first-class queue radiated an unmistakable aura of self-importance. Everyone except Amara Chen. Seated in the corner of the lounge, away from the crowds, she was a study in deliberate invisibility. At 29, Amara had mastered the art of being overlooked. Her outfit was expensive but understated, a charcoal gray cashmere tracksuit, white minimalist sneakers, and a simple black canvas backpack. No logos. No flash. No jewelry except for a slim watch with a worn leather band. Her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore no makeup. To any casual observer, she looked like a graduate student who'd lucked into an upgrade, or perhaps someone's assistant traveling on the company dime. The reality was far more extraordinary. 6 months earlier, Amara's private investment firm, AC Ventures, had quietly acquired an 82% controlling stake in Celestial Airways, a once prestigious airline that had been hemorrhaging money for 3 consecutive years. The acquisition had been structured through a labyrinth of shell companies and trusts. The financial press knew that a mysterious private equity group had saved Celestial from bankruptcy, but Amara's name appeared nowhere in the public filings. She preferred it that way. Anonymity was her superpower. Today's flight to Paris was reconnaissance. Amara wanted to experience her investment as an ordinary passenger would. She wanted to see the service, feel the culture, identify the problems. She had deliberately chosen not to notify anyone at Celestial of her travel plans. No special treatment. No theater. Just the truth. As she approached the gate agent to board, she noticed the woman's eyes flicker over her with barely concealed disdain. The gate agent, whose name tag read Patricia, gave Amara's boarding pass a skeptical once-over. "This says first class," Patricia said, her tone hovering somewhere between surprise and accusation. "Yes, seat 2F, Amara replied calmly. Patricia's lips tightened into a thin line. "Did you purchase this yourself, or is this a company ticket?" The question was loaded, intrusive, and completely unnecessary. Amara felt the familiar weight of assumption settling over the interaction. She had felt it 1,000 times before, in boardrooms and bank lobbies and upscale restaurants. The subtle interrogation. The unspoken question, "Do you really belong here?" "I purchased it," Amara said, her voice even. Patricia hesitated, clearly wanting to ask more but unable to find a professional-sounding pretext. Finally, with a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes, she waved Amara through. "Enjoy your flight." Amara settled into seat 2F, a window seat in the second row of first class. The cabin was a temple of engineered luxury, cream-colored leather, polished wood accents, mood lighting that shifted from sunrise amber to twilight blue. Each seat was a private pod, separated by partitions that offered both privacy and a clear view of the aisle. She stored her backpack in the overhead compartment directly above her seat and pulled out a book, a biography of an early 20th century industrialist. As other passengers boarded, she observed them with quiet attention. There was a pattern to first class, a certain uniformity. Most passengers were white, male, over 40, and dressed in the universal uniform of corporate success, tailored suits, expensive watches, leather shoes buffed to a mirror shine. Then came the disruption. A large man in his late 50s, red-faced and breathing heavily, lumbered down the aisle toward seat 2D, directly across from Amara. He wore a crumpled beige suit that strained at the buttons and carried an enormous hard-shell roller bag that violated every possible size regulation. As he reached his row, he looked up at the overhead bin above his own seat, grunted in frustration at its limited space, and then his eyes landed on the bin above Amara. Without asking, without even acknowledging her presence, he reached up and grabbed the handle of her backpack. "Excuse me," Amara said sharply. "That's my bag." The man glanced at her with irritation, as if she were an insect that had buzzed too close to his ear. "There's no room over here. You can put yours under the seat." "There's plenty of room in your bin if you turn your bag," Amara replied. "And mine is already stowed." "Look, sweetheart," the man said, his voice dripping with condescension, "I'm a Diamond Elite member. I've been flying this airline for 15 years. I need this space." A flight attendant appeared, summoned by the commotion. Her name tag read, Jessica, and she had the bright, brittle smile of someone who had long ago learned to prioritize the path of least resistance. "Is there a problem here?" Jessica asked, though her eyes were already on Amara, sizing her up as the source of trouble. "This young lady," the man said, the term young lady weaponized into an insult, "is refusing to cooperate with basic overhead bin etiquette." Jessica's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. She looked at Amara, then at the man, and made her calculation in an instant. "Ma'am," Jessica said, her voice syrupy sweet, "would you mind if we moved your bag to make room for this gentleman? Backpacks are actually supposed to go under the seat." "My backpack contains a laptop and documents," Amara said calmly. "I'd prefer to keep it overhead. As I've already mentioned, there is sufficient space in his assigned bin if his bag is positioned correctly." The man scoffed loudly. "Are you seriously going to argue about this? Some of us have actual work to do." Jessica's smile tightened. She was losing control of the situation, and she didn't like it. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to insist. It's for the safety and comfort of all passengers." "The only comfort being prioritized here," Amara said, her voice still calm but now edged with steel, "is his. Not mine. Not safety. Just his convenience." Jessica's professionalism cracked. "I'm going to get the captain," she said, her tone now openly hostile. "Maybe he can explain the rules to you." She turned on her heel and marched toward the cockpit, leaving a thick silence in her wake. Captain David Brennan was having a bad morning. His divorce proceedings were entering their 8th contentious month. His teenage daughter wasn't speaking to him. And now, 10 minutes before pushback, his lead flight attendant was knocking on the cockpit door with a complaint about a difficult passenger in first class. Brennan was a man built from the blueprints of old-school aviation. At 52, with silver-gray hair and a jaw like a steel trap, he embodied a certain kind of masculine authority. He'd flown fighter jets in the Navy before transitioning to commercial aviation 26 years ago. He believed in hierarchy, discipline, and the absolute sanctity of his command. In his mind, the cockpit wasn't just the front of the plane. It was a throne room. And he was the king. "What's the issue?" he asked Jessica, his voice clipped. "Passenger in 2F. Young woman. She's refusing to follow instructions about overhead bin storage. She's holding up the entire boarding process." Brennan's eyes narrowed. In his experience, difficult passengers usually fell into predictable categories: drunk, entitled, or ignorant. He assumed this was a combination of the latter two. "I'll handle it," he said. He rose from his seat, adjusted his captain's hat, and strode into the cabin with the bearing of a general entering a battlefield. His uniform was immaculate, his shoes polished to a gleam, his 4 captain stripes a visual declaration of his rank. He walked down the aisle, past the curious stares of other first-class passengers, until he reached row 2. He saw the red-faced man in 2D, looking vindicated. And then he saw Amara. David Brennan, like Patricia at the gate and Jessica in the aisle, made his judgment in a fraction of a second. He saw a young woman. Black. Casually dressed. Sitting in first class. His internal algorithm rendered its verdict: she doesn't belong. She's the problem. He didn't see a person. He saw a category. And that category, in his narrow, outdated worldview, was someone he could intimidate into compliance. "Miss," he said, his voice deep and authoritative, "I'm Captain Brennan. I understand you're refusing to follow crew instructions." Amara looked up at him, her expression neutral. "Captain, I'm not refusing anything. I'm simply asking that the standard be applied equally. There is space for both bags. Your flight attendant chose to prioritize one passenger's demand over another's rights." Brennan wasn't used to calm, articulate resistance. He expected stammering or tears. This composed defiance irritated him. "My crew is responsible for safety and order," he said, his tone hardening. "When they give you an instruction, you follow it. That's how this works." "I understand chain of command," Amara replied evenly. "I'm questioning whether the instruction was necessary or fair." A businessman across the aisle, an older white man in seat 3A, cleared his throat. "Captain, if I may, the young woman has a point. There's clearly room in both bins." Brennan's head whipped toward him. "Sir, this is a crew matter. I suggest you stay out of it." He turned back to Amara, and something in him snapped. It was the accumulation of a bad morning, a bad year, and decades of unchecked entitlement. It was the affront of being questioned by someone he had already dismissed as beneath him. "You know what your problem is?" he said, leaning down so his face was inches from hers. "You think you can just waltz into first class and do whatever you want. You think the rules don't apply to you. The rules should apply to everyone equally," Amara said quietly. "Including you." That was the line. The one he couldn't cross back over. In a moment of staggering, unforgivable stupidity, Captain David Brennan raised his hand and slapped Amara Chen across the face. The sound cracked through the cabin like a thunderclap, time seemed to fracture. For a long, suspended moment, no one moved. The entire first-class cabin was frozen in a tableau of collective shock. Amara's head had snapped to the side from the force of the blow. A red mark was already blooming on her cheek. But when she slowly turned her head back to face Brennan, there were no tears in her eyes. No fear. Only a glacial, terrifying calm. The businessman in 3A shot to his feet. "My God! Did you just strike a passenger?" Jessica, the flight attendant, stood with her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide. Part of her seemed horrified. Another part seemed almost satisfied, as if Amara had gotten what was coming to her. Brennan took a half step back, reality crashing down on him. His hand was still tingling. His heart was pounding. He had just committed an unthinkable act, and he knew it. But his pride, his arrogance, wouldn't let him admit it. "She was being insubordinate," he stammered, his voice suddenly unsteady. "I had to maintain control of my aircraft. This is within my authority as captain." The businessman, whose name was Robert Mitchell, was already recording on his phone. "I'm a lawyer, Captain. What you just did is criminal assault. And I will testify to that in any court." Amara reached calmly into the seat pocket and pulled out her phone. Her movements were deliberate, almost ritualistic. She opened her messaging app and typed a single text to a contact labeled, "Lawrence Kim, CEO." The message was brief. Code Sigma. Flight 447 BOSCDG. Asset integrity compromised by command crew. Proceed with departure. Ground containment upon arrival. No external communication. She pressed send. Code Sigma was a pre-established emergency protocol she had created when she acquired the airline. It was designed for catastrophic situations, hijackings, medical emergencies, or in this case, situations where her identity as the owner was at risk of exposure or where the airline's integrity was being actively harmed by its own employees. The instruction to proceed with the flight was calculated. She didn't want this handled on the ground in Boston, where Brennan could control the narrative. She wanted him trapped for 7 hours, stewing in his mistake, unaware of the firestorm waiting for him on the other side of the Atlantic. "We will proceed with the flight," Amara announced, her voice calm but resonant with an authority that seemed to come from nowhere. Jessica blinked in confusion. Brennan stared at her, unnerved by her composure. "Ma'am, perhaps we should," Jessica started. "We will proceed," Amara repeated. She looked at Jessica. "Please place my backpack under the seat, as you originally requested." Jessica, operating on autopilot, did as she was told. Brennan, pale and sweating, turned without another word and retreated to his cockpit. He closed the door and sat in his captain's chair, his hands trembling. Something was wrong. That woman's composure, the way she had taken control of the situation, it didn't make sense. But he had a flight to complete. He would deal with it on the ground. The flight to Paris was the longest 7 hours of David Brennan's life. In the cabin, Amara sat in perfect stillness. She declined all offers of food and drink. She didn't open her book. She simply sat, staring ahead, a silent, powerful presence that unnerved everyone around her. The man in 2D, the catalyst for the entire incident, had shrunk into his seat. He hadn't said a word since the slap. He avoided looking at Amara entirely. Robert Mitchell, the lawyer in 3A, gave her periodic reassuring nods. He had saved his video and already drafted a preliminary witness statement on his laptop. In the cockpit, Brennan flew the plane with mechanical precision, but his mind was a storm. He replayed the slap over and over. His justifications, so solid in the moment, were crumbling. Fear was seeping in. Meanwhile, in an executive office 3,000 miles away, Lawrence Kim, the CEO of Celestial Airways, was having a heart attack in real time. He had received Amara's text at 9:47 a.m. Code Sigma. He knew exactly what it meant. The owner, traveling anonymously, had been compromised. He immediately assembled an emergency crisis team, the head of legal, the head of security, and the airline's PR director. "Pull the crew manifest for Flight 447, he barked. "I want full employment records on every single person on that plane. And I want a security team waiting at CDG when they land. Nobody talks to the press. Nobody talks to anyone." Over the next 7 hours, Lawrence Kim and his team constructed a detailed timeline of the incident using security footage from the gate, witness accounts from other passengers who had been interviewed via in-flight Wi-Fi, and Amara's brief but damning text. By the time Flight 447 began its descent into Paris, Celestial Airways' legal department had already drafted termination papers, and the airline's crisis management team had a full strategy in place. Captain David Brennan had no idea he was flying toward his own execution. The plane touched down at Charles de Gaulle at 11:15 p.m. local time. It was a flawless landing, technically perfect. Brennan felt a small measure of his confidence return. He was back on the ground. He would file a report, frame the incident as a passenger becoming aggressive, and move on. He brought the plane to a stop at the gate. The seatbelt sign pinged off. He heard the sounds of passengers standing, gathering their belongings, preparing to disembark. He took a deep breath, put on his captain's hat, and emerged from the cockpit to stand by the door as was customary. Jessica stood beside him, her face pale, her smile gone. The door opened. Standing in the jetway was a delegation that made Brennan's blood run cold. At the front was Lawrence Kim, the CEO of Celestial Airways. Brennan recognized him from corporate videos and annual reports. Behind him were four others, a severe-looking woman in a suit carrying a briefcase, two uniformed security officers, and a man in an expensive suit who had "lawyer" written all over him. Lawrence Kim did not enter the plane. He stood in the doorway and scanned the first-class passengers as they exited. His eyes were searching, frantic. Then Amara stood up. Lawrence Kim's shoulders sagged with visible relief. He stepped into the aircraft, bypassing the line of disembarking passengers, and walked directly to seat 2F. He stopped in front of Amara and gave a small, deferential bow. "Miss Chen," he said, his voice low and trembling. "I am so deeply sorry. Are you all right?" The cabin fell silent. Every passenger froze. "Miss Chen." The name echoed through the space like a gunshot. Captain David Brennan felt the floor drop out from beneath him. Chen. AC Ventures. Amara Chen. The anonymous buyer. The silent owner. It was her. The nobody in the tracksuit. The difficult passenger. The woman he had slapped. Amara Chen. The woman who owned the airline. His airline. She stood and looked past Lawrence Kim, her gaze locking onto Brennan's. In her eyes, he saw no anger. No triumph. Only the cold, dispassionate finality of a judge who had already passed sentence. "Thank you, Lawrence," Amara said calmly. "I'll be right with you." She walked down the aisle. As she passed Robert Mitchell, she paused. "Mr. Mitchell, my legal team will be in touch. Thank you for your integrity." Robert, still processing the revelation, simply nodded. "Of course, Miss Chen. Anytime." Then Amara reached the front of the plane. She stopped directly in front of Captain Brennan and Jessica. Jessica's face had gone from pale to ash-gray. Her eyes darted between Amara and the CEO, her mind trying and failing to process the seismic shift in reality. And then, with a soft gasp, Jessica fainted. She crumpled to the floor in a heap of polyester and shattered assumptions. No one moved to help her. Amara didn't say a word to Brennan. She didn't need to. She simply looked at him, her gaze boring into him, imprinting his face, his name, his unforgivable action into her memory. Then she turned and walked off the plane. Lawrence Kim threw one final look at Brennan over his shoulder. His expression was a mixture of fury and terror. "Don't move," he hissed. "Security will escort you. You have no idea what you've done." And with that, the entourage followed Amara into the terminal, leaving Brennan standing alone in the doorway of his aircraft, the kingdom where he had been a king just hours before. He was no longer a captain. He was just a man who had made the worst mistake of his life. The executive conference room at Celestial Airways European headquarters was a monument to corporate power. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Parisian skyline, the Eiffel Tower glittering in the distance like a judgmental witness. The table was polished black marble, reflecting the recessed lighting above. This was a room where billion-dollar deals were made and careers were unmade. Today, it was a courtroom. Amara Chen sat at the head of the table, having taken 2 hours to shower, change, and compose herself. The casual tracksuit was gone, replaced by a tailored charcoal gray suit and a white silk blouse. Her hair was pulled back in a sleek bun. She looked every bit the formidable, untouchable figure she was. The red mark on her cheek had faded, but its ghost lingered in the tension of the room. Seated along the sides of the table were Lawrence Kim, the CEO, Margaret Torres, the head of global legal affairs, and Thomas Beaumont, the airline's head of human resources. They had stacks of documents in front of them but dared not open them without her permission. "Bring them in," Amara said finally. 2 security officers opened the heavy doors. Captain David Brennan and Jessica were escorted inside. They looked like prisoners being led to sentencing. Brennan's uniform, once a symbol of authority, now looked like a costume. His face was haggard, his eyes bloodshot. He hadn't slept. He had spent the last 4 hours in a locked airport office being questioned by airline security and French authorities. Jessica had been crying for so long her face was puffy and red, her makeup streaked down her cheeks. They were led to 2 chairs placed in the center of the room, far from the table, isolated like defendants in a criminal trial. Amara let the silence stretch. It was a technique she had learned in her earliest business negotiations. Silence was a scalpel. It made people reveal themselves. Finally, she spoke. "Captain Brennan," she said, her voice soft but razor-sharp. "I'd like you to explain your actions on Flight 447. In your own words." Brennan's throat was dry. He swallowed hard. "Miss Chen, I apologize. Profoundly. My conduct was inexcusable. I was under stress. The passenger, you, were not complying with crew instructions, and I made a terrible judgment call." "A judgment call," Amara repeated, her tone flat. "Let's examine that judgment. When you looked at me, Captain Brennan, what did you see?" Brennan hesitated. "I saw a passenger who was causing a disruption." "No," Amara said, leaning forward. "That's not what you saw. Be honest." Brennan's face crumpled. He looked down at his hands. "I saw." He whispered. "I saw someone I thought didn't belong. Someone young. Someone who didn't fit my idea of what a first-class passenger should look like. Someone black," Amara said quietly. "Someone you could intimidate. Someone you could bully. Someone whose dignity you could dismiss without consequence." Brennan didn't respond. He couldn't. The truth was sitting between them like a corpse. Amara turned to Jessica. "And you, Jessica. Your job is to ensure the safety and comfort of all passengers. Yet you immediately sided with the man who looked wealthy. You ignored procedure. You escalated a minor issue into a major confrontation. Why?" Jessica sobbed. "I didn't know who you were. If I had known." "You would have what?" Amara cut her off, her voice like ice. "Fawned over me? That's the entire point. It shouldn't matter who I am. Whether I'm the owner or a college student, the standard of respect should be absolute. The fact that you would treat me differently if you'd known is exactly why you're unfit for this job." She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the glittering city. "Lawrence," she said without turning around, "when my firm acquired this airline, we didn't just buy planes and routes. We bought a culture. And this incident has revealed that the culture is rotten." She turned back to face the room. "Margaret, I want a full audit. How many complaints have been filed against Captain Brennan?" Margaret Torres, the head of legal, opened a file with visible reluctance. 7 complaints over the past 6 years, Miss Chen. For involved accusations of discriminatory behavior toward minority passengers. All were dismissed by internal review. Amara's jaw tightened. Dismissed. Of course they were. She walked back to the table and placed her hands flat on its surface, looking directly at Brennan and Jessica. "This is not about my cheek," she said. "This is about the systemic failure of this airline to protect its passengers from the prejudices of its own employees. Captain Brennan, your judgment is a catastrophic liability. Jessica, your complicity demonstrates a fundamental failure to understand your role." She looked at Lawrence Kim. "Their employment with Celestial Airways is terminated. Effective immediately." Captain David Brennan felt his entire world collapse in on itself. "My pension," he whispered. 26 years. Margaret Torres opened another file. "Your employment contract includes a clause for termination with cause in cases of gross misconduct, including assault of a passenger. Your pension is subject to review. You will be fortunate to receive any portion of it." Amara delivered the final blow. "Furthermore, she said, her voice resonating with finality, we will be cooperating fully with French authorities and the FAA. We have video evidence from Mr. Mitchell. We have sworn statements from multiple passengers. We will be recommending permanent revocation of your pilot's license. Brennan stared at her, his face a mask of devastated incomprehension. You will never command an aircraft again, Amara continued. Not for this airline. Not for any airline. It was total annihilation. Not just a job loss. The destruction of an identity. The erasure of a life's work. Jessica was sobbing uncontrollably. Please, she gasped. I have 2 children. I need this job. You should have thought of that before you chose to be an enabler of discrimination, Amara said coldly. She nodded to the security officers. Escort them out. Their access to all airline facilities is revoked. As Brennan and Jessica were led from the room, broken and destroyed, Amara returned to her seat. Lawrence Kim looked at her with a mixture of awe and terror. What are your orders, Miss Chen? He asked quietly. Amara leaned back in her chair. We're going to rebuild this airline from the ground up, she said. And we're going to start with the culture. The following months were a slow, grinding hell for David Brennan. The FAA investigation was swift and merciless. The evidence was overwhelming, video footage, multiple witness statements, and the damning detail that he had struck a passenger over a baggage dispute. His license was revoked permanently. The decision was published on the FAA's website, a public record of his disgrace. He tried to find work as a simulator instructor, but the aviation industry is a small world. The story of the slap-happy captain spread like wildfire. No one would hire him. His name was poison. His wife filed for divorce. She had tolerated his arrogance, his absences, his emotional distance. But she couldn't tolerate being married to a man who had become a pariah. Brennan sold his house to pay legal fees and moved into a small apartment in a suburb of Boston. He took a job as a logistics coordinator for a medical supply company. His days were spent staring at spreadsheets, tracking shipments, answering to managers half his age. Sometimes, on clear days, he would see a plane passing overhead, its contrail cutting across the blue sky. In those moments, he felt a profound, aching emptiness. He had lost more than a job. He had lost his purpose, his identity, his entire sense of self. And he had no one to blame but himself. Jessica's fall was quieter but no less brutal. Fired for gross misconduct, she found herself blacklisted from every major airline. Her 15-year career was over. She took a job as a hostess at an Applebee's near her home in suburban New Jersey. The polyester uniform was replaced by another polyester uniform. The difference was that now, instead of serving champagne in first class, she was seating families with screaming children and taking orders for mozzarella sticks. Every day was a grinding reminder of what she had lost. And every day, she served customers who treated her with the same casual dismissiveness she had shown Amara. Karma, she discovered, had a sense of irony. Amara Chen was not interested in simple revenge. Revenge was petty, fleeting, unsatisfying. She was interested in something far more profound, systemic change. She launched what she called the Dignity in the Skies initiative. It was a comprehensive, top-to-bottom overhaul of Celestial Airways corporate culture. First, she brought in Dr. Elena Vasquez, a renowned organizational psychologist who specialized in implicit bias and corporate culture transformation. Dr. Vasquez designed a mandatory training program that was unlike anything the airline industry had seen before. It wasn't a PowerPoint presentation. It wasn't a video with corporate platitudes. It was immersive, uncomfortable, and transformative. Pilots were put through scenarios where they played passengers experiencing discrimination. Flight attendants role-played interactions with passengers who had disabilities, who spoke limited English, who dressed unconventionally. Executives spent a week working in customer service, taking complaints, dealing with angry travelers. The training forced employees to confront their own biases, their own assumptions. It was designed to create empathy through experience. Resistance from the old guard was fierce. Several senior pilots resigned in protest, calling the training woke nonsense. Amara didn't try to convince them. She let them leave. In their place, she promoted a new generation of leaders. She appointed Sandra Morrison, a black woman and former Navy pilot, as the new chief pilot. She promoted Kenji Tanaka, a Japanese-American flight attendant who had been with the company for 20 years, to Director of Cabin Services. She created a new position, Chief Diversity and Passenger Experience Officer. She hired Marcus Johnson, a former civil rights attorney, to fill the role. His job was to be the conscience of the company. She implemented a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. Any employee found to have engaged in discriminatory behavior toward a passenger was immediately suspended pending investigation. If the allegation was substantiated, termination was automatic. No warnings. No second chances. She tied executive bonuses to measurable improvements in customer satisfaction scores, particularly among minority passengers. The airline's marketing was completely reimagined. Gone were the generic shots of planes and skylines. In their place were intimate, documentary-style portraits of real passengers, an elderly Somali woman visiting her grandchildren. A trans couple on their honeymoon. A disabled veteran traveling to a reunion. The new tagline was simple and powerful, Celestial Airways. Every journey. Every person. The transformation didn't happen overnight. But over the course of 18 months, the changes became undeniable. Customer complaints dropped by 68%. Complaints related to discriminatory treatment dropped by 91%. Employee satisfaction scores, initially devastated by the upheaval, began to rise as the toxic elements of the old culture were purged and replaced with a sense of purpose. The airline won 3 industry awards for customer service and corporate culture. Revenue increased by 22%. Passengers weren't just flying Celestial because it was convenient. They were flying Celestial because they wanted to support what the airline had become. Amara stood in her office in Boston, looking down at the city, holding the latest quarterly report. The numbers were extraordinary. But the number that mattered most wasn't profit. It was the single-digit percentage of discrimination complaints. She thought back to that moment on the plane. The shock of the slap. The humiliation. The rage. But she hadn't sought revenge. She had sought justice. Systemic, lasting, transformative justice. David Brennan had been grounded. Jessica had been fired. But in their place, thousands of others, passengers and crew alike, had been given the dignity and respect they deserved. 2 years after the incident, Amara found herself at a corporate event in New York. Celestial Airways was being honored by the National Urban League for its commitment to diversity and inclusion. As she was leaving the venue, walking through the lobby of the hotel, she saw him. David Brennan. He was wearing a cheap security guard uniform, standing by the hotel entrance. His posture was slumped, his face weathered and tired. He looked a decade older than his years. He was checking credentials for some corporate function in the ballroom, a job that required no skill, no authority, just the ability to stand and look official. Their eyes met. Brennan's face went through a cascade of emotions in rapid succession: recognition, shock, shame, and finally, resignation. He looked like a man who had been waiting for this moment and dreading it in equal measure. Amara could have walked past him. She could have pretended not to see him. But something made her stop. She approached him slowly. He stood frozen, unable to move or speak. "Mr. Brennan," she said quietly. He swallowed hard. "Miss Chen. I." His voice cracked. "I don't even know what to say." "Then don't," Amara said. "Just answer one question. Why did you look at me that day and decide I didn't belong?" Brennan's eyes filled with tears. It was the question he had asked himself 1,000 times in the dark hours of sleepless nights. Because it was easy, he whispered. Because you didn't look like what I thought a first-class passenger should look like. Because I was in charge, and I had always been in charge, and I never questioned whether my authority was built on something rotten. He paused, his voice breaking. Because I was raised in a world that taught me that certain people belonged in certain places, and I never examined that belief. Not until I lost everything. A tear rolled down his weathered cheek. I'm not asking for forgiveness, he said. I don't deserve it. I just want you to know that I understand now. I understand what I was. What I did. And I'm so sorry. Amara looked at him for a long moment. She saw not a monster, but a broken man who had been undone by his own ignorance and arrogance. I hope you find peace, Mr. Brennan, she said finally. But more importantly, I hope you use what you learned to teach others. That's the only redemption available to you. She turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, a ghost of the man he once was. 6 months later, Amara was on a Celestial Airways flight from Boston to Tokyo. She sat in first class, seat 3A. Not as an inspector. Not as an owner. Just as a passenger. The flight attendant who served her was a young South Asian woman named Priya. She was warm, professional, and treated every passenger with equal dignity and respect. The co-pilot who made the final cabin check before takeoff was a black woman in her early 30s, Captain Michelle Okafor. She stopped briefly to greet the first-class passengers, her smile genuine and confident. During the flight, Amara watched a senior flight attendant spend 15 minutes patiently helping an elderly Chinese passenger who spoke no English, using translation apps and hand gestures to ensure she understood how to use the entertainment system. The attendant never showed a hint of impatience or condescension. Amara leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes. The cycle was broken. The culture had changed. The airline that had once been a breeding ground for casual prejudice and unchecked authority had become a model for dignity and respect. She thought about David Brennan, standing in that hotel lobby in his security guard uniform. She felt no satisfaction in his downfall. She felt no joy in his suffering. She felt only a quiet, profound awareness that justice had been served. Not revenge. Justice. He had lost his kingdom. But thousands of others had gained their dignity. And that, Amara realized, was the only thing that mattered. David Brennan's story is a sobering reminder that authority without accountability is tyranny, and that prejudice, no matter how unconscious, carries a cost that can destroy lives. Amara Chen could have chosen the path of simple vengeance. She could have destroyed Brennan and moved on. But she chose something harder and more meaningful. She chose to transform the system that had created him. The best kind of karma isn't punishment. It's transformation. It's taking the ugliness of the world and using it as raw material to build something better. Captain Brennan lost his wings. But in his fall, thousands of others were given the freedom to soar. What would you have done in Amara's position? Would you have sought revenge or redemption? Justice or transformation? Let us know in the comments below. If you believe in the power of dignity, the importance of accountability, and stories where arrogance meets its match, hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the 8th Theory for more real-life inspired dramas where karma is served with precision. Remember, the quietest person in the room is sometimes the most powerful. And the greatest power isn't the ability to destroy. It's the ability to rebuild. Thank you for watching.